People who have gone to summer camp as a child, what was your creepy scary experience? I went to Girl Scout camp when I was around 8 years old. So around 2001, all the counselors were young 20-year-olds. There was a girl in my group who did something to piss off the counselors. I don't remember what, but I know it was minor. It was the middle of summer and super hot, and she was moderately overweight. They made her sit in the sun and wouldn't allow her to have any water as punishment. They were terrible people. Made me super afraid of them as a kid. My camp counselor thought it'd be a good idea to take a group of 11-year-olds out of the warm cabin we were sleeping in and instead sleep overnight on the outdoor stage they used for camp plays. It must have been 10 degrees out. I was so cold. It was unbearable. I couldn't conserve anybody heat because I had a stick for a body and my sleeping bag wasn't made for that type of camping. I remember being tense and scrunched up in a ball. Every movement I made was like dipping my legs in ice. The outside of my sleeping bag was wet and cold from condensation, which made it worse. Eventually we walked back at 4 AM because all the kids couldn't take it anymore. It wasn't creepy, but it was scary to be so cold and tired in the dark. I still remember it. Stayed at a week-long camp in the early 80s. Our cabins were a mix of old lumber, built in the 40s or 50s and new cinder block from the 70s. A series of storms hit one night and my old cabin was shaking like a ship at sea. A camp director banged on our door and told us to grab a sleeping bag, a pillow, a jacket and our shoes. And we hiked mostly in the dark to the rec center basement. Tornado sirens were blaring, and we could hear, but not see trees crashing in the woods around us. We made it, and hunkered down through the storms. But that walk was the longest half mile of my life. I was young, like 11, 12 years old, and at Girl Scout camp. One night, after lights out, we were told by our counselors to stay in the cabins. Latch the doors, get under the beds and turn out all lights. Some old guy had gotten drunk and trespassed. He had been walking around the property, but luckily didn't find any of the campgrounds. Rumors were he had an axe, but I don't think that's true. Hey, look up the Camp Scott murders, or don't if that sort of thing bothers you. We were playing soccer and someone shattered my leg. Broke it in 8 places. There was no swelling, so they said I was faking it, and they wouldn't take me to the hospital. They sent me back to my cabin for the night. I hopped around for a day, but the next night I was in too much pain to sleep, so I limped to the nurse's office. Broke in and took a handful of Benadryl, just so I could sleep. That night, a group was doing an overpass in a 3-sided shelter, and decided to have a peanut butter fight before bed. One kid fell asleep with peanut butter in his hair, and woke up when a skunk walked into the shelter, and pulled a piece of his scalp out. The kid punted the skunk out of the shelter, which caused it to spray everyone on the overpass. So they had to take the kid for rabies shots, so they might as well take me along to get x-rays, since they were going anyway. Helen Keller could have pointed out the breaks on my x-rays. My youth group stayed at a campsite for a weekend trip. We were all in the cabin playing card games when someone with a gorilla suit ran by the cabin and started banging on the door. It really freaked everyone out because it was no one in our group. They came back a couple times until one of the adults confronted the person and they ran away. They never found out who the person was. As a 13-year-old kid, I went out into the woods at like 1 AM with a headlamp to pee, just immediately behind my cabin. Because I didn't want to walk to the wash house while I'm peeing. I look forward and see a large bear just staring at me. Would have pissed myself if not for the fact that I was already peeing. Either way, I just finished my stream while he stared at me and walked backwards back to the cabin. He turned around and walked away, but there was no chance in heck that I would turn my back on a bear and run the other way. Went on a camping trip. I was one of the first ones out of the bus and had to use the public bathroom. I notice a few daddy long legs on the wall outside the bathroom and think nothing of it. I open the door and am immediately greeted by thousands, if not millions of daddy long legs that are covering the bathroom from top to bottom. The bathroom was big as well. like 3 stalls and 3 urinals. That, and coupled with the fact that our camp counselors were sadistic and told us preteens a bunch of scary stories, then jumped out of the woods in the middle of the night screaming with bloody Jason masks, I stayed in my tent most of the time after that. This was early 90s at a school camp. I got up during the night to go to the camp toilet. It wasn't far away. I could see it from our tent. There wasn't anybody around. On my way back, I spotted a man I didn't recognize shining a torch into the side of the boys' tent to make shadows appear. When he saw me approach, he put his torch away and walked away, but was sort of hovering around the campsite. I thought he was campsite security and that I was going to get into trouble for leaving my tent during the night, and as I was an anxious kid, it kept me up all night. As I couldn't sleep, I noticed for a good hour or so that the guy was still walking around and shining his torch into the side of tents. I could hear him and see the light. In the morning, I was falling asleep at breakfast and my friends were taking the piss about it. One of the teachers noticed and thought I was getting sick, so she came over to ask if I was alright, and I said I had been up all night because of the camp security guard shining his torch into tents. She looked horrified and said, "What camp security?" and went off to tell one of the male teachers. It turned out that the campsite didn't have security and the police were called out. Some guy who was known to the area for being a ex-offender had recently been released from prison and was living in the nearby forest in a tent. During scout camp I had a tree branch fall on my head. I was under tree when I heard a cracking noises above me. I could tell it wasn't safe, so I attempted to move somewhere safer. And I guess the universe had it out for me, because I only made it about 4 feet before the branch landed squarely on my head. Luckily it wasn't that big and was soft from being rotten, so it didn't cause any major damage. It hurt like heck though, and put me in a lot of shock. 10 years old. Summer camp in the mountains. One of the big events of the week was an overpass hike up the mountain, which I was already dreading because of my asthma. And when we got up there, instead of tents we slept in a tarp that had been set up to cover the ground, up and then over us, meaning our feet were pointing out into the forest. I woke up halfway through the night to snuffling sounds and heavy footsteps. Then something bumped my feet, which were sticking out a little farther than the rest of the group. I froze up and waited for what I'm almost 100% convinced was a bear lose interest and move on. But I never went back to that camp for summer camp again. The camp instructor director making sure all us boys took off all our clothes and watched us shower. Very creepy. I was on a canoeing trip. It was a trip that had been done by this camp for 10-20 years. Same canoeing portion of a pretty well-known river. Every year on the first day of the canoe trip, kids and staff members would jump off this rock on the edge of the river. It was probably 20 feet up in the air estimating, but the water was deep. Probably 10-12 feet of water. This group of kids asked to make the jump, just as thousands of kids had done before. We tested the jump by having the tallest staff member jump off the cliff. He safely did so, just as always. So then the kids went and did the same. Several kids jumped, came up and were all fine. Then one kid jumps, comes up and says, "I think I cut my knee." Everyone laughed, but then this kid said, "No, seriously. Come look." There was a giant chunk of the fat around his knee missing. If the injury had been elsewhere, it would be pumping blood out. It could have been much worse. But the kid was fine. He went to the hospital and got 12 or so stitches. He didn't rejoin the trip, but he went back and stayed there. 2 weeks at camp. Needless to say, no kid ever jumped off that giant rock again. From our camp. I was about 12, and I was at sleepaway camp and the counselors took us on a hike into the woods for a night. When it came time to go to bed, of course none of us were actually falling asleep, and we overheard the counselors talking about the police looking for someone. We later learned one of the kids was in the middle of a serious custody battle, and that the dad was planning on taking the kid, and that the reason we were in the woods was so that he wouldn't find us at the cabin. No idea if it was actually dangerous, but looking back it definitely is unsettling. Went to a Boy Scout summer camp in the mid-late 90s. They had an archery range where we all were learning how to shoot. They were big on safety. But it was the 90s, so anyways everyone shoots. And we are downrange getting our arrows, then we hear someone yell out in the covered shooting area. I look up and see the semi-special needs kid holding her arrow at full draw, and let's go. It's the kid standing 5 feet from me in the arm. It's chaos, everyone's running around and screaming. The kid with an arrow stick out of him is just standing there in shock. Next year there was no more archery training. Consider subscribing if you enjoyed this video, and if you want to see more of Reddit universe.